The first thing Callum Dunbar's wolf said when he saw her was, "Mate." The second thing it said was, "She smells like old paper and the good kind of coffee, the kind you have to grind yourself. We must acquire her immediately." Callum, who was currently trying to figure out how to open the bafflingly thin metal slate the university called a laptop, ignored his wolf. He had more pressing concerns, namely that he, the Alpha King of the Silverwood Conclave, ruler of all packs from the northern ridge to the sunken coast, a wolf who had once taken down a full-grown grizzly at 16 and won a territorial war before his 23rd birthday, was about to fail a first-year history seminar. His beta, Alistair, had called the plan the single most idiotic, harebrained, catastrophically absurd idea since your father tried to settle a land dispute with a handshake and a side of elk. Callum had reminded Alistair that he was king, and this was a matter of pack security. The girl, Fern, was a 17-year-old Omega from a distant allied pack, sent to this human university for a gifted program. Her bloodline was ancient and powerful, a line of peace weavers thought to be extinct, and a pack of violent, ambitious rogues wanted her. They were stalking her, waiting for an opportunity. Callum couldn't send a squad of his enforcers. It would expose the pack's existence and paint a giant target on Fern's back. He couldn't pull her from the school without alerting the rogues that they'd been noticed. The pack's silent vigil protocol was clear. Protection must be unseen, unacknowledged. So he had done the only logical thing. He had enrolled. As Cal Dunbar, mature student, major undecided. "The glowing rectangle is mocking us," his wolf complained as Callum poked the laptop's screen, leaving a smudge. Nothing happened. "I could bite it." "That will not help," Callum muttered under his breath. A student next to him shot him a strange look. He offered a tight, kingly nod, which only made the student edge his chair away. This was a disaster. He was surrounded by humans who all seemed to intuitively understand these arcane devices. They typed with a speed that defied nature, their faces bathed in the sterile blue light. Callum had spent the last 6 years running a pack of 400 wolves spread across a territory the size of a small country. He had not, at any point during that time, needed to connect to something called campus Wi-Fi. Growing up in the Silverwood compound, 50 miles from the nearest paved road, no television, no internet, electricity from generators that worked when they felt like it, had prepared him for many things. This was not one of them. That's when he saw her. She swept into the lecture hall like a minor hurricane composed of frazzled energy and determination. She had a mountain of books clutched in her arms, a pen tucked behind her ear, and a smudge of what looked like ink on her cheek. Her hair was a chaotic pile of brown curls escaping a clip, and her eyes, wide and fiercely intelligent, scanned the room for a seat. They were the color of whiskey, and when they flickered over him for a brief, dismissive moment, his wolf sat up and begged. "Mate, that one. Her. Go get her. Her fur would be very soft. We could nap in a sunbeam together. We would be excellent nappers." Callum's heart, an organ that had been reliably doing its job for 28 years without incident, gave a painful lurch. He was a king. He did not lurch. But the scent that reached him, coffee, old books, and something else, something uniquely her, like ozone after a storm, hit him like a physical blow. He felt his own eyes flicker gold for a dangerous second and forced them back to normal. Control. He was the epitome of control. He was also, at that moment, a complete idiot. She took the last available seat, which was, by some miracle of the moon goddess, directly next to him. She plonked her books down with a heavy thud, pulled out her own laptop, and had it open and glowing in under 3 seconds. She began typing immediately, her fingers flying. Callum watched, mesmerized and appalled. The professor, a man with a beard that seemed to be actively trying to consume his face, began to drone on about the socioeconomic impact of the Carolingian Renaissance. Callum tried to pay attention, but his wolf was having a full-blown internal parade. She is very focused. This is a good trait in a mate. She would be good at organizing the den. Our pups would be both clever and well-organized. We should start making pups immediately. Quiet, Callum breathed, squeezing his eyes shut. Sorry, a voice said next to him. He opened his eyes. The woman, the mate, was looking at him, an eyebrow arched in question. Nothing, Callum said, his voice coming out as a rough bark. He cleared his throat. I was just thinking aloud, about the Carolingians. She gave him a long, searching look. Her gaze dropped to his completely blank laptop screen. Right, the Carolingians. They're a lot to take in. Her tone was dry, laced with an amusement that made the tips of his ears burn. He needed to say something a normal human student would say. Indeed, their reforms to currency were quite something. She blinked. They were. You're a history major? I am interested in history, yes. It wasn't a lie. His pack's elders had drilled it into him since childhood. Oral histories passed down through generations with the precision of sacred text. He knew the formations at Hastings and the smell of the camp before Agincourt, not because he'd been there, but because the wolves who had been there had told the wolves who had told the wolves who had told him, sitting cross-legged in a freezing longhouse at age 9. In the Silverwood conclave, history wasn't something you studied. It was something that happened to your family. The professor announced a 500-word response paper due at the end of class. A collective groan went through the room. Callum felt a cold dread that had nothing to do with rival alphas or ancient curses. He looked at his inert laptop. He looked at the woman typing beside him. He looked at the slowly ticking clock. He was going to fail. The Alpha King was going to be defeated by a pop quiz. Tell her we are a king, his wolf suggested. She will be impressed. She will do the glowing box work for us. Callum took a deep breath. He turned to her. Pardon me, he said, infusing his voice with the calm authority that made armies halt. I seem to be having some technical difficulties. She stopped typing and looked at his laptop again. She leaned over, and the scent of her was so overwhelming he felt dizzy. You have to press the button, she said, her voice gentle, the way one might speak to a lost child. She reached out a slender finger and pressed a small circular button on the side of the device. The screen lit up with a welcoming chime. Callum stared at it. He felt his entire world tilt. Ah, he said, the only sound he could manage. The button. She gave him a small, pitying smile that was somehow the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. Happens to the best of us. I'm Peggy, by the way. Cal, he managed. His wolf purred, a low, embarrassing rumble in his chest. Peggy, his wolf sighed. A good name, a strong name. We will name our first female pup Peggy. Callum Dunbar, king and warrior, put his head in his hands. Alistair was right. This was the most idiotic idea he'd ever had. And he was absolutely, irrevocably doomed. The tutoring session was Peggy's idea, born from the spectacular train wreck of Cal's first essay. He'd turned it in, handwritten, on heavy cream-colored paper, in a script so old-fashioned she thought it was a joke at first. The content was even stranger. He'd written about the Battle of Hastings from a perspective so intimately specific, the morale of the men on the left flank, the quality of the Norman ale, a digression about William the Conqueror having no sense of battlefield etiquette, that it read like first-hand testimony. He had cited the entire thing as oral tradition. Her professor had handed it back with a single large red question mark on it, and a note suggesting he seek help at the campus writing center. Cal had looked so lost, so genuinely bewildered by the rejection, that a wave of pity washed over her. He was like a golden retriever who'd been scolded for tracking mud in the house, utterly clueless as to the nature of his crime. So she'd found him in the library, staring at a row of encyclopedias with the grim focus of a man preparing for a duel, and offered to help. "Okay," Peggy said, sliding a cup of truly terrible library coffee across the table toward him. "Let's start with the basics. You can't cite oral tradition when you're talking about the specific anxieties of a Saxon shield-bearer in 1066. Cal took a sip of the coffee and didn't even flinch. That was the first weird thing. Nobody drank that coffee without making a face. "But it is oral tradition," he insisted, his deep voice earnest. "These accounts have been passed down in my community for generations. My grandfather's grandfather—" "Ask her if she would like to hear the account of Hastings in the original cadence," his wolf offered. "We do an excellent dramatic recitation. We were complimented by Elder Marin." "No, Cal," Peggy said patiently. "I'm sure your community has a rich oral history, but this is a university. You need to cite published historians who theorize it. See?" She pushed a book toward him. "This is Professor Albright's work on logistical failures in early medieval warfare. You read this, you find his argument, and you write, 'As Albright argues.'" He stared at the book as if it were a venomous snake. "But Albright is wrong about the flank positions. The left wing was anchored by—" He caught himself, jaw clenching. "That is to say, I have heard a different account." "Great," Peggy said. "Then you cite Albright and you argue with him. That's what academics do. We argue with dead people using footnotes." He picked up the book. His hands were huge, dwarfing the paperback. They were covered in a faint tracery of silvery scars, another strange detail on a man who was a walking collection of them. He was built like a mythological statue, all broad shoulders and solid strength, yet he moved with a startling, silent grace. He looked like he should be chopping down trees or wrestling bears, not struggling with MLA format. From across the library, Callum spotted Fern. The girl was tucked into a carrel surrounded by books, her face pale and strained. He saw two young men, both with the wiry, hungry look of rogues, watching her from a few aisles over. They were pretending to browse the shelves, but their focus was entirely on her. Every instinct in him went sharp and cold. The part of his mind that mapped sightlines before he sat down, that had already catalogued every exit in this building, was screaming. Threat. The girl. And Peggy was here, close enough that any fight would put her at risk. "Easy," Callum whispered to himself. "What was that?" Peggy asked, looking up from her notes. "Nothing, just frustrated with Albright. He's very verbose." Peggy narrowed her eyes. "You just made a sound like a faulty garbage disposal." "Ahem. A tickle in my throat." He forced his attention back to her, back to the safe, sane world of footnotes and theses. Being near her was both a balm and a torture. His wolf wanted to preen, to bring her something, a fresh kill, a perfectly constructed den, something worthy. Instead, he had to sit here and pretend he didn't know how to use a search engine. "So, this internet, it contains all the books?" "Not all of them, but a lot of them. Look." Peggy leaned in, her arm brushing his. A jolt, hot and electric, shot up his arm. He froze, every instinct screaming at him to pull her closer, to bury his face in her hair and just breathe. She smelled like everything good. Something behind his ribs, the part that was wolf, the part that was always wolf, went very still and very certain. This one forever. "You type your search terms in here," she explained, oblivious to the quiet catastrophe happening inside him. "Let's say, Norman Conquest, primary sources." Her fingers danced over the keyboard. A list of links appeared. Callum stared. "It's instantaneous." "Well, yeah, it's the internet." She looked at him with that familiar mixture of pity and confusion. "Cal, where are you from, exactly?" Like a very, very remote cabin with no electricity? Something like that, he said, which was accurate enough. Silverwood Keep had electricity, technically. The generators worked about 70% of the time. He'd spent most of his childhood doing homework by firelight, which had been fine because his homework had been tracking deer and memorizing 300 years of pack law. He spent the next hour trying to absorb what she was teaching him, his brain split in three. One part was listening to Peggy, trying to understand the bizarre rules of modern academia. Another part was tracking the rogues across the library, his senses stretched taut, cataloging their every move as they circled Fern's position. The third and loudest part of his brain was entirely occupied by his wolf, which had moved on from romantic declarations and was now critiquing Peggy's organizational system with genuine admiration. She color codes her notes. This is a sign of a superior mind. Our filing system at the Keep is an embarrassment by comparison. She should reorganize us. Cal, are you listening? Callum blinked. Yes, of course. Footnotes. I was talking about plagiarism for the last 5 minutes. Ah, yes, plagiarism. A terrible crime. In my community, it is punished most severely. The last wolf caught plagiarizing a pack chant had been assigned to pup-sitting duty for a full year. The humiliation was legendary. She sighed, but there was a smile playing on her lips. You're a weird dude, Cal Dunbar. I've been told, he said. He risked a small smile back. It felt unfamiliar on his face, a muscle he hadn't exercised much in the 6 years since his father's death had dropped the weight of 400 lives onto his shoulders. In that moment, with the scent of old books in the air and Peggy's eyes on him, the rogues and the burden of his crown faded to a low hum. There was only this small table, this impossible woman, and the dawning, terrifying realization that he was enjoying himself. He was enjoying being a weird dude named Cal. His wolf, for once, was in complete agreement. She called us a dude. This is a term of affection, I have decided. We are her weird dude. That night, long after the library had closed and the campus had gone dark, Callum slipped out of his small off-campus apartment and walked to the tree line at the edge of the university grounds. The forest here was young and thin compared to Silverwood's ancient stands, but it was enough. He checked the darkness with every sense he had. No human eyes, no security cameras, nothing but the rustle of wind and the distant hum of traffic. He stripped, folding his clothes into a tight bundle and stashing them in the hollow of an oak. The shift came like breathing out. His bones rearranged, his senses blew wide open, and then he was down on 4 legs, the world remade in scent and sound and the silver-gray wash of wolf sight. The relief was immediate and enormous. He'd been holding human form for 3 days straight, and his body had been making him pay for it. The dull ache behind his eyes, the restless twitch in his hands, the way his skin felt like a shirt buttoned 1 size too small. Now, running through the thin woods in long, ground-eating strides, he felt like himself again. He ran the perimeter of the campus in a wide arc, his nose working. The rogues had been here. Their scent clung to the underbrush like old smoke, sour, unwashed, tinged with the sharp chemical note of wolves living rough and angry. He counted at least 6 distinct trails, more than he'd thought. He marked his territory in a deliberate circuit, the wolf's way of saying, I am here, I see you, try it. The woods opened onto a ridge overlooking the campus. From here he could see the glow of the library, the dark shapes of the dormitories, the small window of Fern's room with the lights still on. He sat on his haunches and watched until it went dark. The wolf was quiet now, alert and satisfied in a way that had nothing to do with words. Sightlines clear. The small one is safe. Run back. Run fast. It is a good night for running. He ran. He ran until the restlessness bled out of his muscles and his mind went clean and sharp. Then he circled back to the oak, shifted, and stood for a moment in the cold air, slightly disoriented the way he always was in the first seconds after, the world suddenly smaller, flatter, less. He dressed and walked back to his apartment, where he fell asleep in under a minute, still smelling the forest on his own skin. The library was supposed to be a sanctuary. For Peggy, it always had been. It was a place of quiet, of order, of knowledge neatly contained on shelves. But lately, her sanctuary had been invaded by chaos in the form of Cal Dunbar. He was a paradox she couldn't solve. One moment, he'd be asking a question so basic it was staggering, like how to use the self-checkout machine, which he'd stared at as if it were a hostile alien artifact. The next, he'd drop a piece of historical insight so specific and obscure it would send her scrambling for her own research, only to find he was maddeningly correct. He was tutoring with her in their usual spot, a secluded table near the dusty political science section, when a grad student from her department, a notorious mansplainer named Todd, swaggered over. "Brennan," Todd said, not acknowledging Cal, "I read your draft proposal for the dissertation. Bold. A little ambitious, don't you think? That primary source you're banking on is notoriously unreliable." Peggy stiffened. She opened her mouth, but Cal spoke first, his voice quiet and flat. "She didn't ask for your assessment." Todd turned, surprised, as if a piece of furniture had addressed him. "Who's this?" Peggy put her hand on Cal's arm. She felt the muscle beneath her fingers go rigid as stone, but she held firm. "I've got this," she said, meeting his eyes. Something fierce flickered there, gold almost. And then he sat back, jaw tight, ceding the ground. She turned to Todd. "The source is unreliable by Dumont's standard, which, as I'll demonstrate in my proposal, is itself built on a flawed translation of the original Latin. Dumont mistranslated concilium as conspiracy instead of council, which skewed 60 years of subsequent scholarship. My framework corrects for that. But thank you, Todd, for your concern." She smiled. It was the kind of smile that had edges. Todd opened his mouth, found nothing in it, and left. Cal watched him go with a look of such transparent satisfaction that Peggy almost laughed. "You wanted to hit him," she said. "I wanted to do considerably more than hit him," Cal admitted, his voice still carrying that strange, low resonance. "But you handled it better than I would have." Something warm bloomed in her chest at that. Not that he'd wanted to defend her. Plenty of men thought they needed to do that. But that he'd stopped. That he'd listened when she said she had it. That was rarer than it should have been. They worked in comfortable silence for another hour. But Peggy's mind was only half on the citation she was formatting. The other half was compiling a list. A list of things about Cal Dunbar that did not add up. She'd started keeping it 2 weeks ago, in a small notebook she used for stray research thoughts. She hadn't shown anyone. She wasn't even sure why she was doing it. But she was a historian. Pattern recognition was what she did. The list so far. 1. He moved wrong. Not badly, too well, too quietly. He'd caught a book she'd knocked off the table before it had fallen more than 6 inches, his hand appearing from nowhere with a speed that made her blink. He'd laughed it off. She hadn't. 2. He knew things he shouldn't know. Not just medieval history. He'd casually mentioned that a specific tapestry in a textbook illustration had been repaired with the wrong color thread in the 17th century, a detail so obscure it had stunned their professor into silence. When pressed, he'd said, "It's well known in my community." Everything was well known in his community, apparently. 3. He was watching someone. The quiet, dark-haired freshman, Fern, from her Lit 101 tutorial. Peggy had seen Cal positioning himself near her 3 times now. Once across the quad, leaning against a tree. Once in the library, seated with a clear sightline to her Carol. Once in the campus coffee shop, his eyes tracking her to the door. He never approached. He never spoke to her. He just watched, with a focus that was either creepy or protective, and Peggy's gut, against all logic, said protective. 4. The men. Peggy had noticed them because she'd been watching Cal, and Cal had been watching Fern. 2 men, maybe mid-20s, lean and sharp-featured, who kept appearing wherever Fern was. They weren't students, they didn't carry books, they didn't buy coffee. They just lingered, and when Fern moved, they moved. Peggy didn't know what any of it meant, but the pattern was there, and patterns were her job. Later that week, Peggy saw him walking across the campus quad. He was watching Fern again. She was sitting on a bench, looking distressed, her phone pressed to her ear. Cal didn't approach. He took up a position on the far side of the quad, leaning against an old oak tree, and watched. He was perfectly still, blending into the late afternoon shadows with an ease that should not have been possible for a man his size. Peggy watched for a full 10 minutes from the steps of the history building. When Fern finally gathered her things and hurried toward her dorm, Cal waited until she was safely inside before he relaxed, pushing off the tree and continuing on his way. He hadn't seen Peggy watching him. But she'd seen something else. One of the men, the lean, sharp-featured ones from the library, had been sitting on a bench near the parking lot, watching Fern too. When Cal had taken up his position by the tree, the man had looked at Cal, and something had shifted in his posture. Recognition. And then, carefully, he'd left. Cal Dunbar was more than just a weird dude. He was a man standing between that girl and something bad. Peggy didn't have the full picture yet, not even close. But she had the shape of it, and for reasons she couldn't quite articulate, reasons that made her logical, academic brain scream in protest, she found herself wanting to know every single detail. The fear she should have felt was being crowded out by a powerful, reckless curiosity. And something more, something that felt suspiciously like a crush, which was, objectively, the most illogical development of all. Callum knew the rogues were getting bolder. He smelled their desperation on the wind, sour and greedy, clinging to the edges of the campus like a stain. They were no longer content to watch Fern. They were closing in. He'd spent the last 3 nights running the perimeter in wolf form, his paws churning through wet leaves, his nose cataloging every shift in the scent map. He'd found their camp, a cluster of crude shelters in a ravine 2 miles north, reeking of old meat and fury. At least a dozen wolves, too many for one to handle alone, even a king. He had sent a coded message to Alistair. Situation escalating, require support. Also, need more of the small square sweet cakes from the bakery on Elm Street. Mate enjoys them. Alistair's reply had been swift. Support inbound, and they're called brownies, you feral disaster. Stop trying to court a PhD student with pastry. During the day, he maintained his cover as Cal, the hapless student. It was becoming harder. His instincts screamed constantly, the proximity to both his mate and the threat to a pack ward creating a tension that lived under his skin like a second pulse. He found himself scanning every room for exits, assessing every stranger, his hands wanting to shift even when the rest of him held firm. His knuckles ached, his jaw ached. He needed to run, and there wasn't enough night in the day for the running he needed. You seem jumpy, Peggy commented during a study session that had devolved into her essentially restructuring his entire outline. Did you have too much coffee? Something like that, Callum said, his eyes fixed on a man in a hooded sweatshirt lingering near the library entrance. The man smelled wrong. He smelled like the camp. His wolf went flat and focused, the way it did when play stopped and survival started. Near Peggy. Near the den. This one is bold. This one is testing the perimeter. Cal? Peggy touched his arm. The contact blazed through him, and it took every ounce of discipline not to turn, gather her up, and carry her somewhere safe and far away. But she was looking at him with those sharp, whiskey-colored eyes, and in them he saw something he hadn't expected. Not just concern, calculation. "Those men," she said quietly, "the ones who keep showing up near that freshman girl, Fern. I've been seeing them for weeks, Cal." His blood went cold. She'd noticed. Of course she'd noticed. She was the most observant person he'd ever met. "What men?" he said, and hated himself for the lie. "Don't," Peggy said, her voice low but firm. "Don't do that. I'm not stupid. You watch her. They watch her. You're not a stalker. I've been watching you long enough to know the difference. You're protecting her from something, and I need you to tell me what." He was quiet for a long time. The rogue near the entrance shifted his weight and drifted away. Callum's wolf tracked him until he was gone. "I can't tell you everything," he said finally. "Not yet. But you're right. She's in danger. And I'm here to make sure nothing happens to her." "Are you some kind of cop?" "No." "Military?" "No, it's a family obligation. Her family and mine are connected. She's under my protection." Peggy studied him for a long moment. "Those men aren't students." "No." "Have you reported them?" "It's complicated. Involving the authorities would make things worse." She leaned back in her chair, arms crossed. He could see her mind working, see the pieces clicking into a picture that was still incomplete but getting clearer. "Okay," she said, "I don't understand this. But if that girl is in danger and those men come near her again, I'm calling campus security. Non-negotiable." "Fair," Callum said. He met her eyes, and for a moment the mask of Cal slipped, and something older and heavier looked out from behind his face. "Peggy, if anything feels wrong, anything at all, you call me. You leave. Don't be brave. Just go." "I'm always brave," she said, but her voice was quieter now, and she didn't look away from him. He forced himself to walk away from the rogue's scent and back to his apartment. He didn't make it to the tree line. He shifted in his bathroom, which was far too small for a wolf his size, knocking over the shower curtain rod and cracking the mirror with his shoulder. He stood in the narrow space, panting, his fur bristling, his reflection a shattered mosaic of gray and gold. The wolf needed out. The wolf needed to fight or run or do something that wasn't sitting in a plastic chair pretending to care about thesis statements while enemies circled people he was sworn to protect. He squeezed through the bathroom door, claws scrabbling on the cheap linoleum, and paced the length of his tiny apartment for 10 minutes, a caged, furious thing. When the worst of it bled off, he shifted back, crouching naked on the kitchen floor, breathing hard, his hands flat on the cold tile. The disorientation of returning to human form was worse than usual, the world too bright, too loud, too flat, like waking up inside a photograph. He stood up, pulled on clothes, and sat by the window. He called Alistair. "How far out are you?" 12 hours. Less if I break several traffic laws, which I fully intend to. How bad? 12 is fine. They won't move before the festival." "And the mate?" Callum was quiet. Then, "She knows something is wrong. She's been watching me watch Fern. She's been watching the rogues. She put it together on her own." There was a pause, then Alistair's voice, stripped of its usual mockery. "She sounds formidable." "She is." "Then stop trying to keep her in the dark. She clearly won't stay there." Alistair arrived the next morning, having taken the role of a visiting linguistics professor from Oxford with far too much enthusiasm. He had procured a tweed jacket with leather elbow patches and a pair of spectacles he didn't need, which he perched on the end of his nose. "You look utterly miserable," Alistair observed cheerfully, stirring sugar into his espresso. They were in the campus coffee shop. "You have the haggard look of a man who has been forced to read undergraduate essays. Oh, wait. The rogues are planning something, Callum said. Their scent is changing. They're not hiding anymore. You did rather spectacularly announce your presence by existing, Alistair said. You're not exactly inconspicuous, Callum. You walk into rooms like you're assessing them for structural weaknesses. The mature student cover was always going to have a shelf life. He is not wrong, Callum's wolf admitted reluctantly. And your mate, the PhD student? How goes the courtship by academic incompetence? Callum's shoulders slumped. She thinks I'm hiding something. You are hiding something. She doesn't know what. Give her time. She'll work it out. She's clearly smarter than you. Alistair sipped his espresso. Speaking of which, I need to run. I haven't shifted in 30 hours, and I'm getting that thing where my teeth itch. They went together that night. 2 wolves, gray and dark brown, running through the thin woods north of campus. Alistair was smaller and faster. Callum was built like a siege engine. They ran the perimeter together, noses low, mapping every change in the rogue camp's scent profile. More wolves had arrived. The camp was larger, the smell angrier. They were massing. On the ridge above campus, Callum sat and watched the lights below. Alistair sat beside him, panting, steam rising from his fur in the cold air. They didn't need words for this. The shared run, the shared vigil, the shoulder-to-shoulder warmth of pack. It was enough. For a few minutes, the anxiety loosened its grip, and Callum felt the bone-deep rightness of being exactly what he was. Then Alistair nipped his ear, which was wolf for stop brooding, and they ran back. The campus-wide alert came the next morning. Tonight, annual Winter Lights Festival on the main quad. Fireworks at 9 p.m. Join us for hot chocolate and festivities. Callum's blood ran cold. A huge, noisy public gathering. Crowds. Fireworks masking sounds. The perfect cover. They'll hit tonight, he said to Alistair, his voice grim. During the festival. Alistair nodded, pulling off the ridiculous spectacles. I'll shadow Fern directly. You run the perimeter and intercept. Try not to level a campus building. Callum found Peggy in the library. She was at their table, surrounded by a fortress of books, her face pale with exhaustion. He stood a few feet away, the words he needed to say lodged in his throat like stones. She looked up. The wary, searching look was there. It had been there since their conversation about Fern. She was watching him differently now, not with fear, with the focused attention of someone solving a problem. Peggy, you should go home tonight. Don't stay on campus. She set down her pen. Why? I think those men are going to make a move. Tonight, during the festival. It's the perfect cover. Crowds, noise, everyone distracted. She stared at him. He saw the gears turning, the analysis running behind her eyes. You think they're going to try to take Fern? Yes. And you and your mysterious family obligation are going to stop them? Yes. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said something he didn't expect. What does Fern know? Does she know she's in danger? She knows. She's been told to stay in her dorm tonight. She won't. She's in my lit tutorial. She told the group she's going to the festival with her hallmates. She's 17. She's trying to be normal. Peggy pulled out her phone. I have her number. She gave it to me after I helped her with an essay. Callum stared. You know her? She's a scared kid in a strange place. I noticed. That's what I do, Cal. I notice things. She met his eyes. I'll text her. I'll tell her I need help with something at my apartment tonight. Get her off campus before the festival starts. That's safer than her trying to hide in a dorm room with a dozen exits. It was a better plan than anything he had. It was specific, human, and it used a relationship the rogues didn't know about. You can't be involved in this, Peggy. I'm already involved. You involved me the second you sat next to me in that lecture hall. She stood up, slinging her bag over her shoulder. I'll get Fern to my place by 7. You do whatever it is you actually do." She paused in the doorway. "Cal, be careful." He nodded, not trusting his voice. She left, and he stood there in the empty library, his chest aching with something that felt like awe. "She is magnificent," his wolf stated. "We do not deserve her, but we will endeavor to." By 7:15, Peggy texted him from her apartment. "She's here. We're watching a documentary about medieval bookbinding. She seems calmer. Whatever you're doing, do it." Callum exhaled. One thread of the knot loosened. Now the rest. The Winter Lights Festival was a cacophony of human joy and sensory overload. Music blared from speakers, strings of colored lights twinkled in the trees, and the air was thick with the smells of hot chocolate, roasting chestnuts, and wet wool. For Callum, it was a nightmare. The sheer density of scents made it almost impossible to isolate the rogues. He moved through the crowd, a shadow in a winter coat, his wolf running hot and alert beneath his skin. Too many. Too loud. Where are they? "Alistair," he subvocalized into the communicator in his ear. "Anything?" "Fern's room is empty. They'll figure that out soon. I'm on the south edge of the quad. I count 4 hostiles, maybe 5. Then Callum caught it. A flicker of movement on the roof of the science building. A silhouette against the dark sky. A crossbow. Silver-tipped bolt, no doubt. A distraction. While all eyes were on the first attack, the rest would move. "Rooftop. Science building." "I see him," Alistair said. "I'm going up. You take the ground." The first firework exploded, gold and crimson, the crowd gasping and turning their faces skyward. And in that moment, the rogues broke cover. 3 of them, moving fast through the crowd. They weren't heading for Fern's dorm. They were heading for the parking lot. They knew. Someone had tipped them. They were going after the car that should have been taking Fern off campus, the car that was mercifully not there, because Peggy had gotten to her first by a completely different route. But the rogues didn't know that, and when they reached the parking lot and found nothing, they would come back angry, and they would start hunting. Callum intercepted them at the edge of the quad. He stepped out of the shadow of the arts building and into their path, and he let the mask of Cal fall completely. He stood the way a king stands, still, balanced, every line of his body a warning. The 3 rogues stopped. "Dunbar," the lead one spat. Big, burly, a scar across his nose. His eyes flashed with feral light. "Where's the girl?" "Gone," Callum said. "It's over. Leave and I'll let you." The man laughed. 3 on 1, Your Majesty. Even you can't." The first one lunged. Callum sidestepped, caught the man's arm, and used his own momentum to slam him face first into the brick wall. He went down. The second pulled a knife, and Callum felt his body do what it had been trained to do since he could walk. Move inside the arc, catch the wrist, squeeze until the bones ground together and the knife dropped. He threw the man 10 feet into a hedge. The third, the big one, the leader, was smarter. He didn't rush. He circled. "You can't keep this up, Callum. We have numbers. We have time. The Peace Weaver girl is too valuable. Someone will get her eventually." "Not tonight," Callum said. "Not ever." The man lunged, and he was fast. Rogue fast, fueled by desperation and nothing left to lose. His fist connected with Callum's jaw, snapping his head sideways. Pain flared. Callum tasted blood. The wolf inside him surged, not as a separate thing, not something fighting for control, but the way adrenaline surges, the way rage clarifies. His vision sharpened, his body moved faster. He caught the next punch, twisted, and drove his knee into the man's solar plexus. The rogue doubled over, and Callum brought his elbow down on the back of his neck. The man hit the pavement and didn't get up. The fight had taken less than 15 seconds. The crowd, distracted by the fireworks, hadn't noticed. But Callum's nose was telling him something terrible. More. There were more, converging on the quad from the north side. Many more. This wasn't a snatch team, it was a war party. He had seconds to decide. He could fight them as a man and probably lose. There were too many. Or he could end it. Here. Now. In front of anyone who happened to look. He pulled out his phone and texted Peggy. Stay inside. Lock the door. Don't open it for anyone. Her reply was instant. What's happening? He didn't answer. He stripped his coat, walked to the darkest edge of the quad, and let go. The shift ripped through him. His bones cracked and reformed, his skin split and fur erupted, and then he was down on 4 legs, enormous, gray, his eyes burning gold. The wolf's senses exploded outward. He could smell every rogue, feel the vibration of their footsteps through the earth. 7 of them coming through the trees. He didn't wait. He charged. The rogues never had a chance. They had expected a man, maybe 2. They got an alpha in full fury, a wolf the size of a small horse, moving like a gray thunderbolt. He hit the first one before they'd cleared the tree line and sent him flying. The rest scattered, panicked, their coordination shattering. Callum ran them down one by one, his jaws closing on limbs and scruffs, disabling, not killing. He was a king, not a butcher. But by the time the last rogue was crawling away into the darkness, whimpering, the message was clear. The quad was empty now, the festival-goers having fled when the sounds of the fight reached them. Sirens wailed in the distance. Callum stood in the ruined grass, panting, his fur matted with mud and someone else's blood, the gold light fading from his eyes. He was alone, almost alone. From the window of her apartment 6 blocks away, Peggy saw nothing, but she heard the howl. It rose over the campus, over the sirens and the distant shouts, a long, raw, primal sound that made every hair on her body stand up. It wasn't a dog. It wasn't a coyote. It was something vast and ancient and full of grief, and it went on until it broke. Beside her on the couch, Fern had gone very still. Her face was white. She knew that howl. She knew what it meant. "Peggy," Fern whispered, "we need to stay inside. Please." Peggy looked at the girl's face, the real, naked terror there, and something in her shifted. This wasn't a mystery anymore. This was a girl who was afraid for her life, and a man who had just done something to save it. "We're staying inside," Peggy said firmly. She put her hand over Fern's. "Nobody's getting through that door." Callum shifted back in the shadow of the science building, shaking, his whole body vibrating with the aftermath. Alistair found him there, tossing him a bag of spare clothes without comment. The beta's face was grim. "The sniper on the roof was Silas's lieutenant. I have him secured. The others?" "Down or gone," Callum said, pulling on a shirt with hands that wouldn't stop trembling. "It's done. It is for tonight. Silas himself wasn't here. He'll regroup. Let him. The enforcers can handle it from here. The silent vigil is blown. There's no point pretending anymore." Alistair was quiet for a moment. "And the mate?" Callum closed his eyes. The howl was still reverberating in his chest, a raw, empty thing. He'd let the wolf's grief out in that sound. Grief for the violence, for the broken cover, for the fact that the woman he loved was 6 blocks away, and the sound of his true voice was probably the thing that would drive her away for good. "She got Fern out," he said, "before any of it started. She figured out the threat, made a plan, and executed it, while I was punching people." Alistair's eyebrows rose. "She extracted the asset?" She invited her over to watch a documentary about medieval bookbinding. A pause, then Alistair's lip twitched. I like her. The next morning, Peggy dropped Fern at the dean's office, where a man she didn't recognize, calm, authoritative, with a slight British accent, was waiting. He introduced himself as Professor Alistair Vane, said he was a colleague of Fern's family and that arrangements were being made for her safety. Fern hugged Peggy hard before she left. Thank you, she whispered, for last night, for everything. Then Peggy walked across campus to Cal's apartment. She'd been up all night, not panicking, thinking. She was a researcher. When confronted with an impossibility, she did what she always did. She worked the problem. The howl, the speed, the way he moved, the scars, the bizarre gaps in his knowledge, the inhuman focus, the growling. The men who weren't students, the girl he was protecting, his community with its oral histories and severe punishments and family obligations that apparently required you to enroll in a university under a fake name. She'd gone to the window when the siren stopped, and she'd seen something on the quad in the dim light. A shape. Too big, too low to the ground, moving with a fluid power that made her legs go weak. And then it was gone, and the howl came. She didn't have proof, she had a pattern, and the pattern was insane. But Peggy Margaret Brennan had built an entire academic career on trusting patterns, and this one was screaming. She knocked on his door. He opened it looking like hell. Unshaven, gray-faced, dark circles under his eyes. A bruise bloomed purple along his jaw. His knuckles were split. He stared at her as if she were an apparition. Fern is safe, Peggy said. Your friend Alistair has her. I know, he said, his voice raw. Thank you. For what you did, you saved her life. You saved her life. I just invited her to watch a documentary. She paused. Can I come in? He stepped aside. The apartment was small and bare. A bed, a table, a chair, a window. It smelled like him, that deep, clean scent of pine and cold air, and under it, something sharper. Blood. He hadn't fully cleaned up. She sat in the chair. He stood by the window, as far from her as the small room allowed, as if afraid of taking up too much space. The silence stretched, thick with everything neither of them was saying. I heard something last night, Peggy said. After the sirens. A sound. It wasn't a dog, Cal. It wasn't any animal I've ever heard. He was very still. And those men, they weren't muggers or gang members. They were something else. And you, the way you move, the things you know, the way you just dismantled that man who grabbed Fern 2 weeks ago. You're something else too. She took a breath. I've spent the last 12 hours trying to find a rational explanation. There isn't one. So I'm going to ask you a question, and I need you not to lie to me. For once. He turned from the window. His face was stripped bare, no mask, no pretense. Just a man braced for impact. Ask. What are you? The silence was absolute. She watched him struggle with it, watched the war play out across his features, the instinct to protect her from the truth, fighting the need to finally tell it. I am a wolf, he said. His voice was barely a whisper. Not metaphorically. I shift. I become a wolf. A real one. Fur, teeth, 4 legs. The men who came for Fern are wolves too. I'm their king. The alpha of the Silverwood Conclave. My name is Callum Dunbar, and I enrolled in this university to protect a girl from my pack who was being hunted. And I sat next to you in that lecture hall, and you showed me how to press the button, and my wolf has not shut up about you since. He said it all in one breath, like ripping off a bandage. And then he stood there, exposed. the most powerful person she'd ever met, looking like he wanted the floor to swallow him whole. Peggy sat very still. Her heart was hammering. The rational part of her mind was shouting, but it was a distant, tinny sound, drowned out by the part of her that had known. Had known since the growl in the coffee shop, since the impossible speed, since the howl that had vibrated in her chest like something ancient recognizing something ancient. "Show me," she said. He flinched. "Peggy, you just told me you can turn into a wolf. I need to see it. Otherwise, this is a psychotic break and I need to call someone." He stared at her. Then, slowly, he nodded. He pulled off his shirt and she saw the scars. Dozens of them, silvery and old, a map of violence across his torso. He looked at her one last time, something desperate in his eyes. And then he changed. It was fast, faster than she'd imagined, a ripple, a crack, and then he was gone, and in his place was a wolf. An enormous, gray wolf with gold eyes that looked at her with an expression she recognized. Uncertain, hopeful, terrified. The wolf's head was almost level with hers where she sat. Peggy didn't scream. She didn't run. She pressed her hand over her mouth and her eyes filled with tears. Not of fear, but of the overwhelming, dizzying sensation of the world being so much bigger and stranger than she had allowed herself to believe. All her carefully organized categories, her footnotes and frameworks and scholarly conversations with dead people, and the whole time there was this. The wolf whimpered. A small, soft sound from an animal that could have torn her apart. It lowered its massive head and looked up at her with those gold eyes. She reached out her hand. It was shaking. She laid it on the wolf's broad forehead between its ears. The fur was coarse and warm, and beneath it she could feel a heartbeat. Fast as hers. "Okay," she whispered. "Okay, Callum." The wolf closed its eyes and leaned into her hand. And she felt the vibration of a sound in its chest. Not a growl, something else. Something like a purr. She sat there for a long time, her hand on the wolf's head. The quiet of the small apartment settling around them like a held breath. Then the wolf pulled back, and the shift happened again. And Callum, was kneeling on the floor in front of her, human, shaking, his eyes wet. "I'm sorry," he said, "for all of it, the lies, the pretending. I thought if you knew—" "I know," she said. "You thought I'd run." "Yes." She looked at him, really looked at him. The bruise on his jaw, the split knuckles. The 6 years of carrying 400 lives on shoulders that were broader than they should have to be at 28. The boy who'd grown up in a frozen compound, learning history by firelight, and never once in his life had someone show him how to press a button. "I'm not running," she said. "But I have about 400 questions, and you are going to answer every single one of them, with citations." Something broke in his face, not apart, open. A crack in the wall he'd been building since his father died, and through it something warm and terrified and desperately hopeful. "I don't know how to cite personal experience," he said, his voice rough. "We'll work on it," she said, and reached for his hand. 2 weeks later, Callum sat the retake for his Western history final. He sat in the quiet exam room, a pen in his hand, a blue book on the desk. Peggy had drilled him for hours every day. She had made him write practice essays. She had forced him to cite his sources, even when his source was a pack oral history passed down through 17 generations of wolves. You write, "Silverwood oral tradition holds that," and then you find the closest published account that corroborates it, and you cite that, she'd instructed, completely straight-faced. "You are going to be the most unusually sourced dissertation in the history of this department, and I am going to enjoy every second of it." He finished the exam and walked out into the winter sunshine. Peggy was waiting for him, leaning against the wall, a small, anxious smile on her face. His wolf, which had spent the entire exam providing unhelpful commentary on the exam questions, "This one is poorly worded. We should send a formal complaint to the department chair. Alistair would draft it. He enjoys a strongly worded letter," finally went quiet and just looked at her. "How did it go?" she asked. "I believe I acquitted myself adequately," he said. He got the results a week later, A.B. He showed it to Peggy in her apartment, where they were on her sofa, surrounded by her books. He was learning to use her coffee maker, which he considered a feat of engineering more impressive than anything his pack had ever built. She was learning that he could hear the neighbor's cat purring through 2 walls, which she considered deeply unfair. She looked at the grade. "A.B.," she said, her tone thoughtful. "It should have been an A." He looked at her, at the warm light in her eyes, at the ink smudge on her cheek that was always there, at the way she'd woven herself into his life so completely that he couldn't remember what his world had felt like without her in it. "My pack elders drilled me on this material every day of my childhood. They would be appalled." "Good. Tell them you need better teaching methods. And a bibliography." He laughed. It was still an unfamiliar sound, but it came easier now. She was teaching him that, too, along with footnotes and coffee makers, and how to exist in a world that was brighter and stranger and more terrifying than either of them had expected. "She is happy," his wolf observed, "and she has reorganized our citation system. It is vastly improved. She is the best thing that has ever happened to us, and I include the time we caught that 12-point elk." Callum pulled her closer. She tucked herself against him with the ease of someone who had decided, quite deliberately, that this was where she belonged. The world was still complicated. He was still a king, and she was still a human. But for the first time since his father died and the crown fell on him like a landslide, the future didn't feel like a wait. It felt like a door opening. And the woman beside him had 400 more questions and a color-coded system for getting the answers. And he was going to love every single minute of it. His wolf, for once, was in complete and satisfied agreement. "She organized us. She cited us. She is the alpha of our heart." "This is very sentimental," Callum told it. "We are a very sentimental wolf," it replied. "Now be quiet. She is about to explain the difference between APA and Chicago style, and we need to take notes." 3 months later, on the first warm night of spring, Peggy drove them to Silverwood. Callum had offered to go alone first, to prepare the pack, to ease the transition. She had told him, in the precise tone she used when he tried to cite Wikipedia, that she was not a transition to be eased into, and that she would be coming with him, thank you. He had not argued. He was learning which battles to fight, and this was not one of them. The compound appeared through the trees like something out of the world she'd thought she lived in before she met him. A sprawling old lodge surrounded by smaller cabins, wood smoke rising into the darkening sky, the smell of pine and earth, and something cooking that involved an unreasonable quantity of meat. Wolves ate a lot, she had learned. She had revised her grocery budget accordingly. They were met at the gate by Alistair, who had abandoned the tweed jacket but kept the spectacles, which he still did not need. "Dr. Brennan," he said, with a small, formal bow, "welcome to Silverwood. I've prepared a dossier on pack protocol, ranked by likelihood of accidental offense." "I brought my own notes," Peggy said, holding up a binder. It was color-coded. Alistair looked at Callum. "Marry her immediately." "Working on it," Callum's wolf said. The pack gathered that evening in the great hall of the lodge, a cavernous room with a stone fireplace and long wooden tables scarred by generations of use. 400 wolves, give or take, and every single one of them staring at the small human woman their alpha king had brought home. Peggy stood beside Callum, her chin up, her binder tucked under one arm, looking like a woman about to defend a very unusual dissertation. An elder named Marin, silver-haired and sharp-eyed, approached. She studied Peggy for a long moment, then looked at Callum. "This is the one your wolf chose?" "This is the one I chose," Callum said quietly. "And she chose me." Which, given that she has seen me fail a history exam, is evidence of either extraordinary courage or poor judgment. "Both," Peggy said. Marin's mouth twitched. She turned back to Peggy. "Can you run?" "I can try to keep up. I have questions about your oral histories, specifically your accounts of Hastings. Cal cited them in his exam, and I need to verify his sources." A murmur rippled through the hall. Marin stared at her, then let out a bark of laughter that cracked the silence wide open. "She wants to verify our sources," the elder said to no one in particular. "The human wants to fact-check us." "She fact-checks everything," Callum said. "It is both her greatest strength and the bane of my existence." The laughter spread. Someone pushed a plate of food toward Peggy. Someone else pulled out a chair. A pup, no older than 5, shifted into a small, tumbling ball of brown fur and promptly fell asleep on her foot. Peggy looked down at the pup, then up at Callum. Her eyes were bright, not with tears, with the same fierce, reckless curiosity that had brought her to his door with coffee and books on the worst morning of his life. She sat down, opened her binder, and said, "All right, who wants to go first?" Later that night, after the hall had emptied and the fire had burned to embers, Callum walked her to the edge of the compound where the forest began. The moon was full, hanging low and heavy above the tree line. Somewhere in the dark, wolves were running. She could hear them, distant howls threading through the night like music written in a language she was only beginning to learn. "I want to see you run," she said. He looked at her. "It's cold." "I brought a coat. Go." He shook his head, but he was smiling, that still rare, still new smile that she was slowly coaxing out of him, the way you coax a fire from reluctant kindling. He stepped into the shadow of the trees, and a moment later, the great gray wolf padded out into the moonlight. He was enormous and beautiful, and looking at her with an expression that managed to be both ancient and completely, transparently besotted. She sat on the porch steps and wrapped her coat around her knees. "Go on," she said. "I'll be here." The wolf turned, gathered itself, and ran. He moved like water, like wind, like something that had been running since the world was new and would keep running long after it was old. He vanished into the trees, and for a moment she was alone with the silence and the moon and the enormous, impossible life she had somehow stumbled into. Then the howl came. Not grief this time, something else, full-throated and wild and joyful, ringing off the mountains and echoing back as if the whole forest were answering. She felt it in her chest, in her teeth, in the place behind her ribs where fear had once lived and something better had moved in. She pulled out her notebook. At the top of a fresh page she wrote, "Silverwood Oral History Project, Field Notes, Night 1. She had a lot of work to do. She couldn't wait to start.